welcome to today's Trainer Education webinar, 7 Steps to Effective Coaching Meetings, hosted by HRDQ and presented by Ken Phillips. Today's webinar will last about 1 hour. Before we begin, I want you to note that there is a question chat box located possibly in the upper right corner of your screen. You can use that during the webinar to submit any questions you have. We'll then either answer your questions as they come in during our Q&A session at the end with Ken, or by email after the session. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I will moderate today's webinar. I'm in business development for HRDQ, a publisher of research-based training solutions that improve the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. Today's presenter is Ken Phillips. With more than 30 years of experience in the field of workplace learning and performance, Ken is an expert in the performance management, learning evaluation, and sales performance arenas. He is a frequent university presenter and speaker at ASTD and SHRM conferences. He has authored many learning instruments, including the best-selling Coaching Skills Inventory. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Ken.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that, that very nice introduction. And good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everybody, depending on where you are in the world and listening in on today's webinar. What I'd like to do is just start by just taking a minute or two to review the agenda, so you'll have some idea about how we're going to spend our hour today. And what I want to begin with is just a brief discussion around what is coaching anyway. As probably many of you know, the term coaching has come to mean many different things with many different people. And so what I want to do is just spend a little time positioning what we're talking about when we're referring to coaching here in this webinar. And then what we'll do is I'll introduce you to a 7-step coaching meeting model. And what I found with conducting coaching meetings, that one of the reasons that a lot of managers and supervisors and team leaders struggle with trying to conduct coaching discussions is because they don't have a roadmap on, conduct a meeting and what things need to happen when and all of that. So what I'm going to do is introduce this 7-step coaching meeting model to you. And that's actually,
Ken,
yes.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick. Sorry about this, guys. You moved your slide to your next slide, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. It looks like we're a little bit stuck here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull up the PowerPoint here on my computer, and I'm going to move your slides for you. Okay?
Okay.
So bear with us, everybody on the line. Thank you so much. But give me 1 second here, and we're going to go ahead and move over our pieces. So let's go ahead and get this up here. Okay. All right. That's there. And now, Ken, do you see on your line that I'm on the agenda slide?
I'm on the agenda slide, but I wonder if it's my PowerPoint rather than yours.
That probably is. So go ahead and close out of your PowerPoint. I can see here on my second computer I'm on the agenda slide with everybody else. And we appreciate everybody hanging on here while we get ourselves fabulous. Thank you, Linda, for letting us know you see the agenda slide too. Okay, so go ahead, Ken, close out of your PowerPoint and then bring up your GoToWebinar, and you should be able to see the agenda slide, and I'll go ahead and I'll move your slides for you.
Okay. Okay, so I think I've got it now here, so I think we're good to go.
Okay, great. So go ahead and start for us again, and just go ahead and you can start where you left off.
Okay.
Thanks.
But yeah, just apologize for the technical difficulties. The 7-step coaching meeting model is the model that I just wanted to mention. It's the model that's part of the Coaching Skills Inventory that Sarah mentioned earlier, and that's the roadmap that is in there and that people can follow in terms of conducting coaching meetings, and it also is the assessment provides people with feedback on how well they do each one of the steps in this model. The full focus today is going to be on step number 3 of that 7-step model, on getting agreement, because it is the most critical step in the whole coaching process, and the one that oftentimes gets overlooked or misapplied by managers and supervisors. So that's going to be the focus for the our entire time together today. And then the other point about about step 3 and getting agreement is that the other thing we're going to spend time on is the importance of making sure that this discussion around getting an agreement remains a dialogue and doesn't become a monologue, and some of the pitfalls of getting into a monologue as opposed to having a dialogue discussion around that. And then the last item on our agenda will be the last 8 or 10 minutes or so we're going to reserve for questions and answers. So that's basically how we're going to spend our time. So let's go on to the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what coaching is anyway. And as I mentioned in going through the agenda, over the years, coaching has come to mean a lot of different things to different people, and what I wanted to do is just spend a little bit of time making sure that we were on the same page when we're talking about coaching here today. One of the ways that coaching gets used now, or the term coaching gets used, is really as an occupation, and some of you on the call may even be filling one of these roles under the executive coach or life coach or career coach. Or maybe even a health coach, but that's one of the ways that coaching is used today. And certainly there are many people out in the workplace learning and performance field that one of their major areas of one of their major practice areas is being an executive coach and working with senior level executives in an organization and helping to coach them to be more effective. And then there are people who have a little broader perspective and are life coaches, and so focus on trying to achieve work-life balance and work with people in organizations, particularly executives, to try to achieve that. And then there are career coaches, people who emphasize and specialize in helping people to have a career and how to best approach creating a career path and so forth. And then the last one I've added here is a health coach. That's one that's fairly new, at least it was to me, and only over the course of the last few weeks did I start to get some emails from a company that was starting a certificate program or a certification program around becoming a health coach. And the whole idea was, around working with people to live more healthy lifestyles and so on. So certainly that's one way that one way that the word coaching gets used. So let's go to the next slide. Another term or another way that coaching is used is as really a style of management, and you'll hear organizations talk about we want to create a culture of coaching so that our managers and supervisors and team leaders see part of their role, or see a big part of their role as being coaches and not just purely managers and supervisors and team leaders. And you'll also, some of you may recognize the situational leadership and the fact that one of their leadership styles is identified as coaching. So clearly the word coaching also can refer to a style of management. And then go to the next slide. Today, what our focus is really talking about coaching defined as a problem-solving discussion, which is really directed towards improving some aspect of an employee's work performance. And so it's this one-on-one conversation between a manager and an employee, or a supervisor and an employee, or a team leader and a team member, where what we're focusing on is how we can improve some aspect of the employee's work performance. And it could be where there is a performance issue or a performance problem, or it might even be a situation where you've got someone who's an okay performer, but you recognize that in some areas they might even be better than just okay, and so we're going to use this coaching process as a way to try to improve their performance in these particular areas to get them to be even better than an average performer. And the other key part about today's focus on coaching, and what we're going to focus on and talk about, is coaching as really a key aspect that comprises the performance management process. So if you go to the next slide, Sarah, what we have up here is a model of the performance management process, and these are the 4 key elements that make up virtually any performance management process. So it starts with clarifying expectations, and another key element of the performance management process, giving and receiving feedback. And then our third box, going from the bottom, would be coaching, and then the last box at the top would be end of the year appraisal discussions. And at a minimum, this is what performance management means in most organizations. Now, other organizations have expanded on this model and might include things, for example, like an interim appraisal as part of the performance management process. So that would be another box that would be added. Other organizations add things like career development discussions. So those are a separate part of the performance management process. Another one would be discipline. That's another area that some organizations add into as part of the performance management process. And the last one might be compensation. So at a minimum, it would have these 4 activities, but it could also have other things as well, depending on your organization. So what we're going to focus on today is that third box from the bottom, the coaching box. So Sarah, if you go to the next slide. So when we're talking about performance management coaching, we're really talking about an interpersonal process between a manager and an employee, a supervisor and an employee, or a team leader and a team member, where the manager or supervisor or team leader is really trying to help the employee to redirect his or her behavior or performance while maintaining mutual trust. So when we're talking about performance management coaching, we're really thinking in terms of 2 things. One is trying to redirect the employee's behavior or performance, but also while trying to do that while maintaining mutual trust. So it's not an either-or proposition, and we'll see what happens here in a few minutes when you get into that. If you just focus on, trying to redirect behavior, performance, or behavior, and don't include the mutual trust piece, what can happen. So Sarah, go to the next slide. So performance management coaching is different from performance management feedback. And I know there are lots of people have questions about that, and they say, well, where's the line between coaching and feedback, and isn't feedback part of coaching, and so on and so forth. And I would say, yes, that's true, and and yes, in some cases it's hard to draw the line between one and the other, but I've got some things that I think are helpful in terms of trying to separate these two so you can see when and understand when you're doing one versus the other. So performance management coaching differs from feedback by the fact that coaching typically focuses in on patterns of behavior. So what we're really looking at are things that have happened again and again and again and again, and where we may have given feedback previously, but feedback didn't seem to have any long-term effect on permanent behavior change, and so we've decided to move to a coaching discussion. So it typically focuses in on patterns of behavior, where feedback, on the other hand, and performance management feedback tends to be event or situation driven. So an employee does something, either does something well or does something not so well, or something that they shouldn't have done, or something that they didn't do. And so when we're focusing on feedback, what we're really doing is talking about that specific incident or event. And so it tends to focus on the incident-driven or event-driven, whereas performance management coaching typically is patterns of behavior. The other thing that differentiates performance management coaching from feedback is that typically performance management coaching requires a formal meeting because of the amount of time typically required for having an in-depth coaching discussion, and also to indicate the importance of it and make it clear that this isn't just feedback, but with a different kind of discussion. We schedule a formal meeting, so we set a time and a place for the meeting, and we let the employee know we're going to have this discussion. And so those are the 2 primary things that differ, that separate performance management coaching from feedback. Go to the next slide, Sarah. Let's talk a little bit about what performance coaching isn't. It's not chewing someone out, taking somebody to task, or threatening an employee. As I mentioned earlier, we're really trying to do 2 things when we talk about performance management coaching: redirect the employee's performance or behavior and maintain mutual trust. So if we engage in coaching where we chew somebody out, take them to task, or threaten them, we may be able to redirect someone's behavior because, that stuff works. But what happens is we oftentimes, if we do that, we create a situation where the where the resulting outcome is a problem that's worse than the original one, because what typically happens if we engage in these kinds of activities, chewing out, taking the task, or threatening an employee, what happens with the employee is they become what's known as outwardly submissive and inwardly rebellious. So what they're looking to do is they follow, they just walk that narrow straight line about only do what's asked. They're not engaged in their job. And in fact, some employees take it to the extreme of even becoming disruptive, where they start to look for ways to either, get back or get even. So that's the real importance of trying to engage in performance management coaching discussions, where we're trying to maintain mutual trust along with trying to redirect someone's behavior or performance. So go to the next slide. So another thing about performance management coaching, just for positioning purposes, is that it should take place only after an employee clearly understands what's expected. So going back to that performance management model that we looked at previously, the first box was clarifying expectations. So when we're getting ready to hold the coaching discussions, one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is, does the employee understand clearly what's expected? And we're asking ourselves that question because we want to know, have we ever sat down with the employee and had a discussion around what's expected in this particular area? And if we've never done that, what we want to do is start with a discussion around expectations instead of coaching, because it's easier, takes less time, and if it gets the employee back on track, then it means we never have to get into these more complex and more difficult coaching kinds of discussions. So that's one of the things that we want to ask ourselves before getting into performance management coaching. Does the employee clearly understand what's expected? The other thing we want to ask the other question we want to ask ourselves is, has the employee ever received feedback, at least once, about his or her behavior or performance in this area? In other words, have you ever given the person feedback about this before? If the answer is no, then again, what you may want to do is start with feedback, because again, it's easier, and it takes less time, and maybe the feedback itself will be enough to just get the person back on track, and so we won't need to engage in a coaching discussion. So that's why what we want to do is, again, look for patterns of behavior. Now, there is one exception to this rule, and that would be, in some cases, there may be an incident or an event that may be so significant in your mind that you're going to bypass and move right, and bypass feedback and even bypass expectations if it hadn't been talked about previously, and go right to coaching. And an example would be, I had an oil and gas company that I was doing some work with for a number of years, and I was at one of their refineries doing some training with their supervisors and managers, and one of the policies that they had at the refinery was that any safety incident or violation of even the smallest nature went directly to coaching and started there, and depending on the severity of the incident, could even be, they could even take it right to discipline. And that was a policy that they had, because they were so concerned about everybody following safety procedures in the refinery because of the devastating effects that they could have if people didn't follow safety rules, not only injuring themselves but injuring hundreds of other people. And so that would be the exception. So if in your mind an event or a situation is so significant that you think you want to go right to coaching and bypass the feedback, that's perfectly okay. The second thing about performance management coaching is, you want to click to that it also follows a series of logical, interdependent, and repeatable steps. That's what I mentioned earlier when we talked about the agenda and the 7-step model. Coaching discussions are complex kinds of conversations, and people need a roadmap to do these, particularly managers, supervisors, and team leaders. When they're not doing this as a routine part of their job, what they need is a roadmap, so each time they need to engage in a coaching discussion, they have a roadmap to follow, so they know what kinds of things they need to accomplish, what steps they need to accomplish, what skills they need to use, and so on. So performance management coaching will follow this series of logical, interdependent steps and repeatable steps. So we can go to the next slide. This is the 7-step coaching process that I mentioned earlier that's part of the coaching skills inventory. And so the inventory will assess a manager or supervisor or team leader's strengths and development needs in all these areas. And as I mentioned, the one we're focusing on today is only step 3. And so in subsequent webinars down the road, we're going to come back and pick up some of these other steps. But given our time constraints here, we decided to only focus on one step at a time. So this is the 7-step coaching process, and our focus is on getting agreement. So let's go to the next slide. So this is an item from the questionnaire. And so what I'd like you to do is, so imagine at this point, you've just opened a coaching meeting, so you've brought somebody in, we're having a coaching discussion, you've done your pleasantries, you've opened the meeting, said whatever you were going to say there. And so now what you want to do is you've opened the meeting with an employee by explaining the purpose of the meeting, and you now would like to get the employee to agree that a performance issue exists. So these are the 4 response choices that you have, and what we'll do is launch a poll here in a second. But what I'd like you to do is to read through each one of these and decide which one of these best describes what you would do. It may not exactly describe what you would do, but which one would be the closest to a description of what you might do. And then when we launch the poll, because of restrictions on the amount of words we can have, what you're going to see is you'll see the A, the B, the C, the D, and then just a few of these words following the A, B, C, and D. You won't see the whole response alternative. So that's why take a second to read through them now, and then when we launch the poll, you'll have already had a good idea about which one you would select. Okay, the answers are coming in, so keep them coming. Okay, we'll let it go another few seconds here. Okay, so here are the poll results. And so as you can see, 6% of you chose A, 18% chose B, 25% chose C, and 51% chose D. So that means that, and so the correct answer, I'll give you what the correct answers are for these things, because there is a best, a second best, a third best, and a fourth best, and that's the way the inventory is actually scored. But what you'll see here is the best answer was D, as in Delta, and so 51% of you chose D, so that's good. So half of you got the correct answer with this particular item. The second best answer was B, and so 18% of you got that as chose that as your answer. The third best answer was C, and 25% of you chose that one. And the fourth best answer is A, and only 6% chose that one. So as you can see, there are just subtle differences here among the different response choices, but those subtle differences are really important in terms of being able to effectively engage someone in a conversation, particularly around this step of getting agreement. And so thank you, everybody, for participating in the poll. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about getting agreement. As I mentioned earlier, the most critical step in the coaching process, and it is the most critical step because without agreement, if you don't get agreement here at this point in the process, there's little likelihood of either behavior changing at all, or that if behavior does change, that it's only going to be temporary and not permanent. So that's why this is the most critical step in the process. Because if you don't get this, particularly when you're dealing with a pattern of behavior, so this is something, again, if it's a pattern, where we've given feedback to the employee about this once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, decided at some point feedback isn't working, and we need to, raise this to a different level, try a different approach, and that's when we move into coaching. But if we don't get agreement here, there's little likelihood that the behavior is going to change, or that if the behavior does change, that it's going to be permanent. And this is all rooted in the research that's done in the whole area of alcohol and drug addiction treatment, where in alcohol, for example, in Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, they ask people to stand up in the meeting and say, "My name is Ken, and I'm an alcoholic." They want people to verbalize and to agree, that they've got a problem. And so that's the science that's behind this step. But obviously, we're not doing alcohol counseling or, drug counseling or anything like that. We're engaging employees in discussions around trying to redirect their performance or behavior. And so what we want to do is make sure that we use a process that's a little gentler, and also make sure that we include that element of building mutual trust. So let's go to the next slide, Sarah. So some reasons that managers fail to get agreement, because it is a step that often is either overlooked or not dealt with very effectively. And the first reason that, most common reason that managers fail to get agreement is because they assume. So that many managers bypass the step simply because, they assume that, well, we've talked about this before, and so that and they assume that the employee or the team member is going to view the situation in the same way they do and see it as a problem in the same way they do. But that's often not the case, particularly when you're talking about a pattern of behavior, because if they saw it as a problem, they probably would have corrected it. So there's something else going on which causes them to, to continue to engage in this kind of behavior, and that's when we're going to, and we'll address that when we get into the consequences area. But the second reason that this step gets typically shortchanged is because managers just avoid this step. They're uncomfortable conducting these coaching discussions. As I mentioned earlier, it's not something they do on a regular basis. They don't have a lot of practice at it. They may not have a good model to use on how to even conduct one. And so a lot of managers just avoid these things altogether, and they hope for, divine intervention, where somehow, for whatever the reason is, somehow the employee is going to recognize the failure of his or her ways and and get back on track on their own. And of course, once in a while that happens, but divine intervention doesn't happen all that often, and so it's not really a real effective way to get agreement. So the third one is that managers generalize. So when they get in here and start talking about and focusing on the step of getting agreement, what they do is they talk only generally about the employee's performance issue instead of citing, specifics. And so what happens in these cases is that the employee is not likely to see his or her behavior or performance any differently from anybody else. For example, if you talk to somebody about showing up to work late, and invariably people are going to show up to work late. Most people have, if they get stuck in traffic or something happens at home and they can't get away on time or whatever the reason is. So everybody probably at some point shows up to work late. And so what happens if you only generalize about that, then the employee is likely to see his or her performance no different than anybody else's. And so without those specifics, telling the employee, well, here's how many times you've been late, and here's how late you've been, and here's how this compares to other people, they're not likely to see their behavior any different, and they're not likely to see this as a problem. And the last one is something that I call the right string, wrong yo-yo. And so what happens, as I see in lots of managers when they engage in coaching discussions, again, particularly because we're focusing on patterns of behavior, they try to seek agreement on the wrong issue. And what they focus on is they strive to get the employee to agree that the events leading up to the coaching meeting are what the issue is. The fact that the employee has been late, 3 times over the last 3 weeks, and, the average time late has been X or Y, whatever it is. So they focus on that, and they miss the larger, more important issue that a performance problem occurs each time the event happens. So they're not trying to get agreement on the fact that showing up to work late is a problem. They're trying to get agreement around the fact that the employee has shown up to work late the last, 3 times during the last 3 weeks. So they're focusing on the right string, but they got the wrong yo-yo. So you need to make sure they're focused on the right thing. So let's go to the next one, Sarah. So the now question becomes, so how do we go about getting agreement? So what do we need to do in order to get someone to agree that, yes, this is something that I need to focus on, it's a performance issue that I need to improve in or do something differently in, and so on. And what we want to do is we want to focus in on really two things in order to get agreement. And we need to have both of these in mind, and we need to be able to execute on both of these in order to be successful at this step. And the first one is we need to paint, when we get into the step of getting agreement, paint a clear mental picture for the employee that there's a difference between, what the employee is doing and what's expected. And so that's what we need to paint that clear picture using those specifics. So that's why when we're going to get ready to conduct a coaching meeting and we've done feedback, we need to start keeping track of how many times we've given feedback and what the event is that we're focusing on, so that we've got some facts that we can revert back to when we talk about getting agreement. So we can paint this clear mental picture for the person that there's this difference between what's expected and what they're doing. The second thing we need to have in mind, and this is the second part of being able to successfully get agreement, is we need to help the employee understand the negative consequences that are associated with his or her behavior. As I said earlier, because we're focusing primarily on patterns of behavior, if the employee, based on some of our feedback, recognized that this was not something that they should be doing, they would correct their behavior or performance based on the feedback. But because it's a pattern of behavior, what that tells us is more than likely the employee sees more positive consequences for continuing his or her behavior than negative consequences associated with this, which will take us to the next slide. So focusing on the first part of this and painting the clear mental picture, what we want to, and then we'll get back to the consequences here in a minute. What we want to help people visualize is, what they've done. So using numbers or facts gathered about their performance, we want to paint that picture. Here's what you've done. And then what we want to do is also clarify what our expectations are of them. So remember when I talked earlier about if you haven't talked about expectations, you need to start there. So what we're doing here at this point, when we've gotten into this coaching meeting and we're focusing on this step, is we're painting the picture about here's what you've done, and here's what's happened, and here's what my expectations are, and you can see how what you're doing is different from my expectations. And this is where I mentioned earlier about the other thing you might include in terms of what the expectations are, particularly if you're talking to people about things like showing up to work late, turning in late reports, things like that, that probably everybody does, sometime. That what you want to do is you may want to gather some facts about how the employee you're talking with and how their performance differs from other people, on the team or other people in the department. And I don't mean by specific names there, like, you've done it 5 times and Sally only did it 2. I'm just talking about the group as a whole. So here's how you compare to the group as a whole, and you can see that your behavior or performance is different. So let's go to the next slide. So here's an example of what that might look like when you're painting the picture for the employee during that first part of this step of getting agreement. So you might say something like this. Now, I'm not sure you've been keeping track. But over the past couple of months, 3 of your last 4 reports have been late, and it's averaged anywhere from 1 to 3 days. And, I also thought I made it clear in some of our previous, discussions that we've had, and particularly when I've given you some feedback, that my expectation is that, all reports need to be turned in on time. And now if you wanted to do a comparison thing here, you could insert now a fact in here and you say, the fact that you've turned in these 3 out of the last 4 reports, and during the same time period, what's happened with the rest of the people in the department is I've only gotten, 3 other late reports. So your behavior is different. And then ask the question, can you see how this is a problem? So we're asking the person to, to say, yes, okay, I recognize it's a problem. I can see how that's an issue I need to work on, or that's an issue I need to correct. If you hear anything other than that, like, well, okay, yeah, I guess I can see how that might be a problem, but other people turn in late reports as well, then you don't have agreement. So what you're listening for is clear words out of the employee's mouth that, yes, okay, I can see how this is an issue that needs to be corrected, improved, or changed. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So now we're talking about clarifying consequences. And so what we want to do is we've got a little situation here, and just to give you a chance to sense how this comes into play in an actual coaching discussion, here's the situation. So an employee for the past several months has been turning in late reports, and you've given the employee some feedback on 3 different occasions about that. And each time you've done that, things have gotten better. But then after they get better for a short time, the reports start, coming in late again. So imagine that scenario. And so what I'd like you to do is to just indicate in the chat box or the question box what kinds of negative consequences might the employee see for turning reports in late. And just list them in there, and then Sarah will read some of them off as you list them in there. So negative consequences the employee might see for turning reports in late.
We've already got a few coming in here, Ken. Most of them are about written warnings or evaluation results. We've got some pressure from coworkers, no raise, which is a pretty good one,
Yep.
decreased opportunity for promotion, loss of awards. Oh, there's a lot coming in here.
Yeah, written now. I guess I can read
see
them.
them now?
Sarah, you don't have written now. Yeah. Incentives decreased, performance review, delays in team production, hours cut back, all kinds of good ones. Oral and written demotions, progressive discipline, yeah, okay. Written warnings, verbal warnings, loss of trust, firing. Okay, we got a lot of those. That's good. They're relatively easy to come up with when we think of negative consequences. So all kinds of negative consequences. Now let's change it, and we're going to have the same situation. And Sarah, bring up the next. So now what I'd like you to do is do the same thing, but focus in the chat box, and this will be a little harder. What kind of positive consequences might the employee see for turning in late reports? And I know people might struggle with that, but there are some positive consequences for turning in late reports. And what might be some that the employee might see for that? Okay, more time to get it done, more time to do other things or extra things, more attention, right? Okay, nothing will happen. Yeah, right, based on the past, nothing happened. Control issues, okay. Get other work done, good, okay. I just take my time, better quality, okay, good. Less work, there's one in there on less work, that's another good one. Okay, any more? Maybe given less, less reports to do. Okay. Putting off the inevitable. Okay. Build a case to, not sure what the rest of that says. Time to spend on the phone. Okay.
My favorite, Ken, is my favorite here is a coworker will do it for you.
Okay. Good. Good. Okay. Good. So we've got positive consequences. So Thanks for all of those, everybody. So let's go on to the next slide, Sarah, and we can then use those in that little activity that we just did. So if you imagine that situation and that the employee's performance problem is a balance scale, what happens is the reason that the feedback didn't work is because they see more positive consequences or more positive reasons, if you will, for continuing to do what they're doing than they see negative consequences associated with the act. Because as you can understand, that people generally, as a general rule, don't do things they don't perceive to be in their own best interest. So if they saw it as in their best interest to get the reports in on time, they would. So the way the employee is looking at this situation is they're aware of some of the negative consequences because, right, you've given them feedback and you've mentioned some things and, you've talked to them and maybe you've even mentioned some of the other things that came out on our negative consequences list during some of the feedback stuff. So it's not that they're unaware of negative consequences, but in their mind, the way they look at this is they see more positive consequences associated with this situation than negative consequences. And so in their mind, they're doing something that's in their best interest. And so if you go to the next slide, what the manager's task is, or what our task is if we're conducting the coaching discussion, during this discussion of consequences, is to tilt the scale so that the employee sees more negative than positive consequences associated with this behavior or performance. So we're trying to tilt the balance scale in the other direction. But one of the things that makes this step difficult is that tilting the scale is not simply a matter of quantity. So it's not a matter of, finding out how many positive consequences the employee sees and then trying to come up with one more negative consequence than positive consequences. So it's not purely a quantity issue. It has to do with other things that go on in the employee's head that we don't know about that make this step a more difficult one to achieve, but nevertheless certainly can be accomplished if we follow the science behind this and then also engage in the right process. So go to the next slide. So part of the thing about understanding negative consequences, there are some important key things that you need to understand about those in order to shift that and get the scale to go from the one side to the other. And one of the things you need to keep in mind is that, and when we're talking about consequences, is that negative consequences that are viewed as more certain to happen and more imminent, that happen sooner, carry more weight. So when we looked at our negative consequences and we did our little brainstorm exercise about negative consequences the employee might be aware of, we could go through that whole list. We could see things that were more certain and more imminent and things that were more certain and less imminent, or things that are less certain, less imminent, all those different, combinations. And so when we discuss consequences, and one of the things that we want to do to prepare for a coaching meeting is to get down on paper what we believe to be these negative consequences, and also take a look at those and put some value on them in terms of how certain they are to happen and how imminent they are. So if you start talking to people about it's going to affect your performance rating or performance appraisal rating, and that performance appraisal discussion and rating period is 6 months away, two things are likely to happen. One is probably the employee's not likely to see that as very certain because they think, well, in 6 months, good chance you're going to forget about this. And so they're not certain it's going to happen. And number two, it's certainly not imminent. And so it's okay to use those kinds of consequences and discuss all those, but keep in mind that those are less powerful and have less effect on the employee than things that are more certain and more imminent. Let's go to the next. And the other key thing to keep in mind about consequences is that there are two types of consequences. And it's important to understand and distinguish between these two. So there are natural reoccurring consequences, and those are ones that just occur naturally every time the employee does this thing. So if it's turning in late reports, natural reoccurring consequence, and we could go back to our list of looking at all those negative consequences, and we could make distinctions between natural reoccurring and imposed. But natural reoccurring are things like, well, if other people use these reports, what's going to happen is if I turn my report in late, I'm going to delay, everybody else who uses this report in their job. So I'm going to put everybody else kind of behind the 8 ball. Another natural reoccurring consequence might be, every time I turn reports in late, you give me feedback. So, that just kind of happens. Every time I've done that, you've talked to me about it or you've mentioned it, and so that's natural reoccurring. There are imposed consequences as well, and those are things that you as the manager, supervisor, or team leader will impose on the employee if he or she doesn't redirect, his or her behavior or performance. Imposed consequences are things like when we had some of these mentioned in our, when we did the brainstorm as well on negative consequences, giving a bad performance review, writing somebody up, giving somebody a written warning, giving somebody an oral warning, taking somebody to the step of discipline as part of the performance management process. Those are all things that you as the manager or the supervisor or the team leader are going to impose in this particular situation if the employee doesn't redirect his or her behavior or performance. But it's important to understand the difference between the two. So keep in mind, consequences, first of all, more certain and more eminent are best. And the other thing is, keep in mind, natural reoccurring versus imposed. So go to the next slide, Sarah. So to achieve agreement, particularly around this discussion of consequences, we want to have a strategy for how we're going to engage the employee in this discussion. And what we want to do is start first by talking about natural reoccurring consequences, because those are the least threatening. Those are the ones that just happen naturally every time the employee does it. And so what we want to do is to get those on the table first. What do you think happens when, you turn in the reports late? And, say, well, you give me some feedback. You say, right, I do that. We talked about that a number of different times. What else do you think happens? Well, I suppose maybe if I turn in the reports late that, that might put other people behind, in their work because they use what's in my report, and say, absolutely right. That's another consequence. And so what we want to, and the reason for understanding the difference between the natural recurring and the imposed is, at this point in the discussion, if the employee brings up imposed consequences, that's okay. You can just jump all over those and support them and say, if they say, well, I suppose you're going to give me you could give me a bad performance appraisal meeting, or I suppose you could write me up. You want to jump on that and say, you're absolutely right, I could do that. Don't want to do that, but I could do that. And so, what you want, the reason for understanding natural reoccurring versus imposed is you don't want to get in there and be bringing up all the imposed consequences. Because the second point underneath there is, the second bullet there, keep this a dialogue, not a monologue. And so the worst thing that you can do is, and this is what happens with lots of managers and supervisors and team leaders, is when they get to this discussion of consequences, and they go in and say, well, okay, let me tell you what's going to happen here if you don't get this thing corrected. I'm going to do this to you, this to you, this to you, this to you. And what that puts you back into is what we talked about earlier, when now what we're doing is, we're the performance management coaching. We mentioned that we saw the guy that was screaming. It's not chewing out. It's not taking the task. It's not threatening. What we're trying to do is redirect the employee's performance or behavior, and doing that while we're maintaining mutual trust. So that's the reason we want to try to stay away from these imposed consequences, particularly when we're in the role of the manager or supervisor. Keep them in your hip pocket. Bring them out if you need them, because if you need to get the agreement, you'll use them. But keep them in reserve, and that's not what most managers do. They want to bring that stuff up early on in the discussion, and so now what happens is it puts the employee on the defensive. The other thing about this discussion around consequences, in order to get this and achieve agreement, is it's not always obvious, when the scale is tilted. Because as I said, it's not just a matter of quantity. So what you're doing is you'll engage the employee in a discussion about consequences after you've gotten 2 or 3, and talked about 2 or 3 out there. Maybe a couple have come from the employee. Maybe you chimed in with one as well. Then you want to go back to asking the question. Do you now agree that this is something that needs to be corrected? So it's like going back, are you an alcoholic? We're trying to get the person to raise his or her hand and say, okay, yes, okay, I finally get the light. I finally see the light. I finally, see that this is something I need to improve. And so what we'll do is just go back and forth between these discussions of the consequences, both the imposed and the natural reoccurring, periodically asking this question until we get the employee to agree. At some point, unless the employee is psychotic, and you may have some of those, but hopefully not many, and so that at some point the employee is going to recognize that, okay, I can see this is really not in my best interest, and the scale will tilt. So that's what we're trying to do with this step of getting agreement. And as I said, it is the most critical step, and it's also probably the most difficult step in this whole coaching process. So Sarah, you want to go to just a quick summary here? So we started with the 7-step coaching process, and what we focused on today was just that 3rd step of getting agreement. And as I said, in subsequent webinars, we'll come back and pick up some of these other steps and talk about them as well, because they too are difficult, although I don't think as difficult as this step. And And there's also, an art and a science behind some of these other steps in terms of how you execute them and, successfully, so we can talk about that. And then the last thing we, just in terms of summary, what we focused on here today is getting agreement, most critical step in the coaching process. And to get agreement, what you really need to do is do these two things: paint a clear mental picture, that there's a difference between what the employee is doing and what was expected, and get the employee to understand the negative consequences associated with the performance issue, so we tilt the scale. And that's what we covered. So Sarah, you want to go to the questions? We've got a few minutes left here, about 8 according to my clock.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ken. Go ahead and, I've got some questions already coming in here. I have one. Let's go ahead and start off with one here from Bill. He says, what should you do if you don't have the exact facts to give the detail around the employee's performance issue?
Great question. Great question. And one of the things that you'll want to do is, if you don't have the exact facts, at least try to come up with an approximation of, like, use a range and say, I don't know how many times you've been late over the course of the last 2 months exactly, but I know it's kind of somewhere in the neighborhood of between, 6 and 10 or, 5 and 10 or whatever. So even close approximations are better than generalizations. And so anything that you can do to come up with approximations is, will work in your favor. So you just don't want to go in there where you're just talking in terms of generalizations, because that is almost certainly will lead to not having a successful outcome in getting people to permanently change their behavior.
Great, thank you. We have this question coming in from several people here. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase a little bit, but Linda has sent it in, and also David as well here. They're asking your input on documentation. So do you propose using actual forms or a certain process? Do you have any recommendations around actual action planning or documentation around those performance issues?
Yes, I would certainly keep some notes someplace around all this stuff. Even the feedback, particularly if you start to see it as a pattern of behavior. In order to have some facts, then I would start collecting those, because you got, it's kind of like a red flag. You've given feedback once or twice, but it keeps coming back. So I'm saying, oops, all right, let's keep track of that, so that I got some facts that I can talk about. And then certainly if you have a coaching discussion, you ought to have some notes about that, because part of you saw some of the steps. The steps in the coaching discussion about about exploring alternatives and getting a commitment to act. And when you get to that, when you get to that point in the process, you're asking the employee to commit to something and what they're going to do and when they're going to do it and all of that. And you want to record that so then you can follow up. Because if the employee hasn't done it, then when you go back to getting agreement again, that's another fact we've got. We talked about this before. You said you were going to do it, you didn't do it, blah, blah, blah. So yes, definitely record that stuff. Keep track of it somewhere.
And many people then, in conjunction with that, are asking around, that really troublesome employee who, you've had several conversations and you've gone through some of those steps, and they're really having a hard time hearing, quote unquote, and raising their hand and saying, yes, this is a problem. Is there any other, detail or anything that you can provide on how you can really help that manager persuade that employee that, yes, there really is a problem here, and making sure that they hear that?
Yes and no, I guess. No, if the employee doesn't really care about whether or not he or she, has a job or keeps the job, probably, nothing's going to work. Mm-hmm. But if there's, if the employee cares at all about, keeping the job, having a job, working with you, working for the company, working in the department, going through and talking about these consequences and having a discussion around that and the negative consequences and, the thing and how that affects other people and affects the department and affects you and how it's going to affect them when you get into the imposed consequences. If they care at all, it should tilt 99 times out of 100. It'll tilt the scale. if they don't care, nothing you're going to do is going to make any difference. And so you might as well start looking at taking steps to find them a different job.
Great. And our last question here that we have time for is from Siren, and they ask, is coaching an as-needed process in your opinion, or should it be mandatory? For example, one-on-ones once a week or something of that nature.
Well, the way we're talking about, if you're using a coaching as a leadership style, you can do it regularly, once a week, once a day, however often. But in terms of performance management coaching, not a leadership style, but performance management coaching, where we're trying to redirect an employee's behavior or performance, and doing that while trying to maintain mutual trust, it should be on an as-needed basis.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone who is sending in your questions. We have a lot of people on the line, so we've got a lot of questions coming in. Continue to keep sending those questions in while we're all on the line here. Questions that we did not get to answer, Ken will actually be writing up answers for those, and we will email those out to you as a PDF document, so everyone will see all the questions that were asked today and Ken's responses to those. We do want to thank you for your time. Thank you very much, Ken, for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Nope, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay, Ken. We do want to let you know that as an exclusive offer, you can get the free shipping on the coaching skills inventory, which is the basis of what Ken talked about today. We have a 30-day return policy on that facilitator material, so you can take a look at it risk-free. If you have any other questions, feel free to send those in to Ken, and we'll certainly make sure we get those responses out. We do appreciate everybody's time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for your participation today. And one other thing that will be coming out to you that that Sarah has, that will be coming out from HRDQ, is I had written an article on this whole step of getting agreement, a whole article on it, and you'll all be receiving a copy of that. So
stay tuned. There will be more coming out on this topic. Thank you very much, and have a good day.